He may be far away in Havana with the Cuban leader Fidel Castro, but back here, George Galloway still making waves, with an interview with the former Mirror editor Piers Morgan in GQ magazine. Mr. Galloway was asked, would the assassination of, say, Tony Blair by a suicide bomber, if there were no other casualties, be justified as revenge for the war in Iraq? To which George Galloway replied, yes, it would be morally justified. I'm not calling for it, but if it happened, it would be of a wholly different moral order to the events of July the 7th. It would be entirely logical and explicable and morally equivalent to ordering the deaths of thousands of innocent people in Iraq, as Blair did. Later in a radio interview, he insisted that he wasn't calling for the assassination and he'd alert the authorities if he heard one was being planned, but he stuck by his original words.
Yes, and I fully stand by it. But what I did go on to say was that this is not what I'm calling for. I'm calling for Mr. Blair to be on trial in The Hague as a mass murderer.
After a campaign expressing strong opposition to Tony Blair and George Bush's policy in Iraq, George Galloway took the parliamentary seat of Bethnal Green and Bow from Labour at the last election.
Mr. Blair, this is for Iraq.
But George Galloway has, according to some parliamentarians, gone too far this time, and they're arguing he should be disciplined.
It seems right for a motion to go before the House of Commons to consider disciplinary action and whether or not he should be suspended for a period of time.
Parliament's in recess at the moment. Any disciplinary action may have to wait. As for Tony Blair's thoughts about George Galloway's remarks, Number 10 say no comment. Carolyn Quinn.
George Galloway's in Cuba at the moment. He spoke on the line to PM. Can I just clarify what the magazine quotes you as saying? You're asked whether the assassination of Mr. Blair by a suicide bomber would be justified if there were no other casualties. You replied, yes, it would be morally justified. I'm not calling for it, but if it happened, I believe it would be of a wholly different moral order to the events of 7/7. Did you say that?
Yes, and I fully stand by it. And if you think about it for 5 minutes, you'll realize that it's ineluctably logical. Mr. Blair has murdered more than 100,000 people in Iraq, and the Iraqi people are an occupied people, illegally invaded. They have the moral and legal right to resist that occupation. Why would that right be restricted to the poor, bloody infantry that Mr. Blair sent into the streets of Iraq? If the Iraqis have a right to resist their invaders, they have a right to resist the officers of the invaders, and if they have the right to resist the officers, they have the right to resist those who are giving the officers their orders. But what I did go on to say, and in fairness you ought to allow me to say this, was that this is not what I'm calling for. I'm calling for Mr. Blair to be on trial in The Hague as a mass murderer. That's the point of view of most of the world. It's my point of view. It's the point of view on which I sought election in the general election 12 months ago against the full might of the government machine, and on which I was elected. I was not elected despite my views. I was elected because of my views.
But you can call for the Prime Minister to be on trial in The Hague. You can say the Iraqi people have been put through a terrible time by him. But that is rather different, because you didn't have to say, in addition, that his assassination would be morally justified.
But politically extremely damaging. I also went on to say that one of the reasons why I don't want this to happen is that it would likely strengthen the pro-war camp in London and Washington.
Does that help your argument? Does that help your argument?
Yes, I think so, because when you're dealing with a moral hypothetical, you have to be honest. And I'm a politician who tells the truth, unlike Mr. Blair. I'm telling you that the ineluctably logical truth is that if the Iraqis have the right, as they do, under international law and under any moral philosophy, to resist foreign invaders of their country, that must include the man who's giving the orders. But that it would be better if they did not. If I knew they were going to, I also say in the interview, I would inform the authorities of their plan to do so, because I don't want it to happen, because it would strengthen those who are making war all over the world.
But
my view. Criticize it if you like, but that's my view, and I assure you it's one held very widely.
Shouldn't you make the argument that it would be better for them not to launch a suicide attack on Mr. Blair because it would just be wrong, not because it would harm their case?
Well, you see, Mr. Blair is the man who began the attacks. He's a mass murderer.
Eye for an eye.
He murdered more than 100,000 Iraqis. No, but you have to see this from the shoes of the other fellow. You have to stand for a minute in his shoes. You have to stand for a minute in the shoes of the Iraqis whose country has been invaded. Now, if you ask me, if my country was invaded by a foreign government, would I consider it morally my right, not necessarily that I would carry it out, but morally my right to strike back at that foreign government that invaded my country? If you ask yourself that question, there can be only one answer to it.
So, while we're in the business of assassinating Mr. Blair, presumably Mr. Bush is in your sights too, and it's equally justified.
Well, they're not in my sights. I've said now, and I, more importantly, said in the article that I did not want that to happen. So I'm not calling for it, and I don't want it to happen. I want both these men in prison for life in The Hague. Unlike Mr. Bush, I don't believe in capital punishment. I want to stop the killing, and the only way to stop the killing is to stop the wars, stop the occupations, reduce the hatred, and thus reduce the bloodshed. That's my point of view. That's what I said before the war, during the war, and since the war.
Wouldn't most people argue that suicide bombing in any circumstances is never justified? Of course you can put yourself in other people's shoes. Of course you can understand terrible oppression and all the rest of it. But suicide bombing cannot be justified.
But the Prime Minister's own wife explained not so long ago that people who are subjected to monumental injustice and suffering are inevitably going to strike back with whatever weapon is available to them. And as I explain in the article, the issue is not the method, whether a stealth bomber or a suicide bomber. The issue is the target. If innocent civilian people are targeted by any weapon, by any bomber, it is morally repugnant and unacceptable. That's my view, but it's not Mr. Blair's view, because he rained down massive violence on civilians in Iraq for a political purpose. That's terrorism in most people's definition. And by the way, while we're on that subject, the very first attack of the Gulf War was an attempt to wipe out, personally, the Iraqi political leadership. That open, stated reason for the decapitation effort in the first hours of the war, why they actually launched the war before their ultimatum ran out. So they believe in the political assassination of other countries' leaders. I myself favor jaw rather than war. It's one of the reasons why I was one of the leaders of the anti-war movement. It's one of the leaders why I'm saying now what I said then. I don't change my views according to prevailing winds or in the teeth of media criticism.
Finally, while we're on moral hypotheses, you've made it clear you don't think there should be any such attack on Mr. Blair, not least, as you say, because you feel it would have a detrimental effect to the case of the people you're speaking up for. Again, a hypothesis. If it was possible for such a suicide bomb attack on Mr. Blair to take place without there being that detrimental effect on their cause, what would you think then?
Well, I said in the article that if I knew of such an attack, I would inform the authorities. You know, I can't be much more clear than that. Indeed, I may well be criticized by people on the other side for saying that, because I know that inescapably it would be damaging, because it would strengthen the war party in Washington and London. So on this hypothesis, and it is a bit of a moral maze discussion, on this hypothesis, I can not move a centimetre. It would be damaging to those of us seeking to stop the war for such an attack on the British or American political leadership to be launched, and it should not be done. And if I knew it was to be done, I'd inform the British and American political leadership and their security services to try and stop it happening.